You're listening to a CNA podcast.
2024. It's been a big year. You might feel exhausted by the news, the conflicts, the politics, the doom and gloom, as my co-host likes to call it. On our final episode this year, we're going to wrap it all up for you, the good and bad. Hi, and welcome to Climate Conversations. I'm Jack Board, and hello to you, Liling Tan.
Hello, Jack.
General thoughts about the year gone?
It flew right by, didn't it? Feels like I got whiplash, or maybe it's because I feel like I haven't slept for weeks thanks to COP29 coverage and all the election coverage that's been going on. I feel like I need a holiday. But hey, it's our last episode for the year before we take a break. And as much as I'll miss y'all, I can't wait to take a long nap. What about you?
I'm with you there.
I bet you're exhausted.
Feeling it. But first, we will be wrapping up the year and then looking ahead into 2025. Now, this episode will be running through some different categories, some makeshift awards, and some things to watch out for next year. Get ready for that. But first, it's the final quiz of the year. Liling, I want you to tell me this week, which of these records was not broken in 2024, was not broken? The caveat, of course, being that this year is not over yet. Some of these are projections where the data is not complete. Okay? It's a multiple choice. A, the amount of deforestation occurring around the world. B, the amount of production of oil globally. C, the hottest daily global average temperature. And D, the levels of carbon dioxide recorded in the atmosphere. Not things really that we want to be breaking, but we've done three of them.
Yes. So I think I might have an inkling. And over the course of this episode, I think we will actually be addressing some of these.
You are coming from an informed position.
Yes.
Having just researched the past year. But answers at the end. Okay, it's news time, Liling. Let's talk COP, because it is finally over. We spent a lot of time invested in it and following it, so let's deconstruct.
Now, when we started talking about this 2 to 3 weeks ago, Jack, we knew that it was going to be difficult. We knew this finance COP29 was going to attempt to accomplish three key things: provide guidance on how countries buy and sell carbon credits, operationalize the loss and damage fund agreed on last year, and also set new higher targets for this climate financing goal that replaces the current one. We did see movement on the first two, but that financing goal, that was a doozy. There was an agreement reached one day past deadline to work towards a $1.3 trillion target by 2035 through a wide range of financing, including from the private sector. It only set aside, however, $300 billion in public financing through grants and low-interest loans for vulnerable nations who wanted at least $1 trillion in funding that wouldn't settle them with more debt. So a lot of the outrage and the backlash that we've been seeing in the news is around this $300 billion figure. Environmentalists, activists, and developing nations made their objections very clear at COP29. Jack, what did you take away from COP? You were there in the first week. You saw all this play out firsthand. Did any of the final agreement surprise you?
We had come into this knowing that it would be contentious, that it would be possibly the most difficult negotiation that COP has faced for a long time. Trying to put a number on public funding from rich nations was a new idea that COP had not really attempted ever before. So it was super ambitious. I think that parties would agree, particularly during this period of deep global mistrust. Obviously, there's a big rift between rich nations and poor nations, and it plays out every time. Probably nobody's happy, actually, with the agreement. And if everyone walks away unhappy, it doesn't really lead to good outcomes, I don't think. I don't think we can afford to have a repeat of something like this again. But we've said that before, and yet they still keep happening. Yeah, that was my kind of hot take.
A lot of it is what happens now, right? Like the UN Secretary General said, this forms the basis upon which countries can build on. So we'll see how that plays out.
It's time for our main story this week. 2024 has been flagged as a critical year for action on climate change. That, as we just discussed, probably hasn't really played out. Looking across the world, it is hard to be positive about what we've seen, but we will try. There are good news stories out there, and of course, there's always nuance to this conversation. We're going to do a review of the year we've just had through 5 different categories. The first one was a big news event that made an impact. Liling, what was that for you?
We're not talking good news, right? Because I don't really have a lot of good news to share.
This one's not a good
Okay.
one. Any news event.
I was just a little bit stumped for a moment there. Okay, so remember the Paris climate deal signed nearly a decade ago, Jack, when countries...
Okay, it's news from this year, remember?
Well, I know, but I'm setting the scene.
Okay.
So remember the Paris climate deal. Nearly a decade ago, countries agreed to cut back on greenhouse gas emissions, set net zero targets, meaning that countries would remove as much emissions as they produce. That's not happening. In fact, the world is actually coughing out more emissions and have reached a record high this year. And that's one of the record highs we were talking about in your quiz. And that's according to projections from the Global Carbon Project released earlier this month. They estimate a 0.8% increase in carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels compared with last year, totaling a spike of 37.4 billion tons. And they see no sign that CO2 emissions from fossil fuels are plateauing. So when I saw this report, it really drove home the message that despite all this urgent calls for action to phase out fossil fuels, to cut back on oil production, to cut back on gas production, it doesn't seem like people are taking this threat seriously. And it just underscores how extensive the gap is between the signs that says we need to do this or we risk our own existence and the people who actually are the offenders, the polluters, the emitters. For me, this was particularly glaring.
I think that report came out during COP29.
Yeah, it did.
And when that landed, it made a bit of a splash and put people on their heels a little bit for sure. For me, the biggest story of the year is regional heat waves. This year seems to all have been about heat. We've been talking about it so much on this podcast throughout the year. We will have the hottest year on record. In June, we had nearly 5 billion people experiencing extreme heat conditions at the same time, linked to climate change. 5 billion people, which I think is shocking. And in Asia, we've seen temperatures in and around 50 degrees Celsius this year. It's been overwhelming hospitals, impacting people's work, their sleep, their productivity. And its impact is uneven and unfair. Lower socioeconomic groups, elderly people and women are more likely to bear the brunt of this phenomenon. We have to always remember as well that the main purpose of the Paris Agreement, all of these meetings and diplomacy around climate change, is actually designed to keep temperatures in check to within 1.5 degrees. And as you said, it isn't out of control. Still some perspective that as humanity, we are doing quite a lot to limit temperature. Enough? That's a different question. So I think the outlook is not good. 3.1 degrees is one of the estimates right now based on current policies. And I think our hot and getting hotter cities is the story of the year and might continue to be until better cooling adaptation policies are implemented alongside these mitigation goals that the world has.
And let's not forget all the typhoons that struck Southeast Asia this year. I don't recall the data, but cost lives, billions of dollars in damages. And expectations are that extreme weather events, the heat waves that you're talking about, as well as these downpours and typhoons, are just going to increase, become more frequent and more intense. So that was also a red flag for me.
Okay, let's jump to category number 2. What was some kind of data or statistic that you really paid attention to and thought, wow, okay, that's happening?
Jack, I don't know if you worry about this as much as I do. I think I'm the only person among my circle of friends who loses sleep about melting sea ice. I can't go to the beach without thinking about it. Did you know that Arctic sea ice retreated to near historic lows in the Northern Hemisphere this summer? 7th lowest on record. And that's according to research from NASA and the US National Snow and Ice Data Center. We don't hear so much about this anymore because it just gets drowned out by all the other climate calamities.
Yeah, I really don't like seeing those pictures. I think I deliberately blocked them out.
Yeah, and it is easy to block out because especially here in Southeast Asia, we don't see the ice, we don't feel that. It's not something that's in our proximity. But Arctic sea ice did shrink by about 2 million square kilometers from the 30-year average that ended 2010. We're talking about losing an area of ice coverage about the size of Indonesia. And where does all that melted ice go? Into the ocean, where surface temperatures also broke records earlier in the year. And speaking of oceans, I'll give you another free stat, Jack.
This is meant to be one stat.
I know, but there's just so much to talk about. And when we wrap the year, I don't want to leave out these things that we need to think about. Okay, so global coral bleaching is now the largest on record. We talked about this in one of our episodes earlier this year, but it's still ongoing. It's getting worse. Reuters recently reported that a whopping 77% of the world's coral reefs have had bleaching level heat stress. That's something you've seen firsthand too.
Yes, I have. We may not have seen the ice melting, but we're seeing the on-flowing effects. I'm going to be focusing on methane here. Another thing that we can't see, but if we could, I think we would be quite alarmed. Now, it's far more damaging to the atmosphere compared to carbon dioxide. And it's staggering to me that the problem is still getting worse. Methane traps around 80 times the heat compared to CO2. So it's responsible for about a third of all planetary heating. And human activity causes about 60% of all methane emissions. The sources are things like agriculture, like cows, landfills, and of course, the oil and gas sector. Actually, it's considered one aspect of this fight on climate change that could be pretty easy to solve. It wouldn't take that much and the impact would be really significant. And so there is this global methane monitoring system. It's called MARS. And what we learned at COP29 is that it has actually alerted various governments and companies around the world to some 1,200 major methane plumes that it's detected. But action has only been taken in 1% of cases. So it's clear to me that companies and governments are just ignoring this really clear problem. That coming despite nearly 160 countries having signed a global methane emissions pledge, and a huge number of oil and gas companies also promised to slash methane basically to zero by 2030. Right now, none of that's happening, and emissions are still on the rise. It's a big fat fail mark for everybody concerned. Okay, now, that's a lot of negative. Let's give a climate conversations prize for a country or a company that has done something good this year.
I tried to think about a company off the top of my head, but I really couldn't. So I'm going to go with a country, Denmark. It got the best ranking on the annual Climate Change Performance Index. And by best ranking, fourth place, because apparently no one did well enough, and no one usually does, to deserve the top 3 spots, which remain empty again. Denmark did outdo Netherlands and the UK, both of which took 5th and 6th place respectively. And that's because Denmark got a very high rating in the renewable energy category. It got a slightly less impressive, but nonetheless high rating in emissions and climate policy, and a medium rating in energy use. And this is, of course, based on rankings by the Climate Change Performance Index. Now, the targets, Denmark's targets include reducing CO2 levels by 110% come 2050 compared with levels from 1990. It's part of the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, working towards phasing out oil and gas. It's also big on financial support for initiatives to address loss and damage. And also, I don't know if you know about this, Jack, is the first country in the world to impose a tax on livestock emissions, which goes to your methane. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, good job, Denmark. Keep doing more. Now, my prize is highly speculative, premature, and I might regret handing it out in this way, but I'm going to give mine to Indonesia. It's more of a encouragement award. Keep going. Aww. Hopefully more to come. And just recently at the G20 summit in Peru, Indonesia's new president, Prabowo Subianto, made some waves actually with some of his comments, big, bold statements about how the country would undertake its green transition. So he said that Indonesia would reach net zero emissions by 2050. Okay, tick there. It would retire its entire coal-fired power plant fleet within the next 15 years. Now, this is a big deal. He's talking about Huge amounts of solar energy, geothermal energy, carbon credits galore. It would require huge sums of money, major infrastructure transformation, but as one of the biggest polluters in the world, it would have a profound positive contribution to the climate fight. Again, still just a statement, but I can see the positive intent, and I think if Indonesia really gets on board, it could be a catalyst for other countries to do the same in our region and beyond as well. Now, at COP, one of the fun things always is when a certain NGO hands out its Fossil of the Day award and they all get dressed up as dinosaurs. It's a whole thing. So without further ado, we're just going to steal that idea. The Climate Conversation Award for Fossil of the Year. Li-Ling, who have you given that to?
Okay, so I'm giving that to Argentina. And not just because the country under far-right President Javier Milei withdrew the delegation from COP29 in Baku 3 days in, the entire delegation. And this sparked concerns that it could withdraw from the Paris climate deal as well. I'm giving this to Argentina because it's also ramping up oil production in the past few years and is investing more in further development. US government data shows Argentina's production of oil, gas condensate, and light hydrocarbons rose 4% last year and by another 6% in the first 9 months of this year. So now South America's second largest economy is among the top 3 largest oil producers in the region. The president has also called climate change a socialist lie, fueling fears that he'll gut forests and backtrack on the country's climate targets.
Yeah, that was a pretty dramatic moment actually in Baku when we just found out, okay, Argentina's gone.
Yeah.
They've just been pulled from the conference. Yeah, and I think that was a setback and showed that some countries just didn't take this process seriously. For me, I'm giving the Fossil of the Year award to the United States. Now, I know you could argue, what about all the advancements under President Biden, the Inflation Reduction Act, hundreds of billions of dollars flowing to clean technologies? Noted. I hear you. It's progress. It's massive progress, actually, in that space. But after an election campaign that basically sidestepped the climate issue completely, which to me shows both neglect of the issue and the deep ideological divisions that it continues to cause in society there, and now the election of Donald Trump, the US is, I believe, failing as a climate leader, given its wealth and its contribution historically to the problem. And the US officials in Baku were basically sidelined, given that President Trump is going to undo as much as he can in terms of agreements and financial deals, whatever they could have come up with. And then, under President Biden, just look at the production of oil and gas that's been happening domestically in the US. Huge stockpiling and exporting of natural gas is setting up years of dependency on fossil fuels, and much of that dependency will flow to Southeast Asia. And then there's this whole trade war with Beijing that also targets many of China's clean technology and materials, things like EVs and solar panels, etc. Okay, that's an economic strategy. But in terms of green leadership, sorry, America, you're getting the fossil prize from me.
No disagreement from me there. I figured you would go with the US.
All right. Bold prediction, something to watch for 2025 as we wrap up this review.
Drill, baby, drill.
Is that you, Mr. Trump?
EIA expects US natural gas producers will boost output next year on rising demand from liquefied natural gas export plants. So it also forecasts global production of petroleum and other liquid fuels will increase by 2 million barrels a day, up from a growth of just 500,000 barrels a day this year. Demand is expected to fall, though, due to economic stresses and the increasing shift to electric vehicles. There's also the COP30 summit happening in Brazil next year. One of the largest oil-producing countries in South America is hosting it. Again, we were talking about petrostates hosting the summits before, Jack. History repeats itself. Or will it? So put that theory to the test again about how effective petrostates can be in leading the charge towards climate action. Next year also marks 10 years since the Paris climate deal came to be, and we're expecting more ambitious climate targets to come. But yeah, the embers of COP29 have barely cooled, and we're talking about COP30 already.
COP30 will be very interesting, I think. And Brazil, yes, of course, they are a big oil producer, also home of the Amazon rainforest. So they have different elements at stake. But yeah, expecting a lot of ambition, a lot of announcements there. Yeah, we'll be probably doing a long countdown to COP30 once again. Okay, for me, looking at next year, after talking about the US previously, I think I'm going to talk about China. Not so much a bold prediction because guessing Chinese policy is fraught and I'm unlikely to be well placed to do it, but as something to watch, I think China is fascinating in the climate space going forward. Clearly a hugely influential player, and no doubt there's tension amid the swirling geopolitics. You have the US expected to be a declining influence in terms of leadership once Donald Trump takes office, so where does Beijing land now? Does it emerge as the big leader, even if it's basically refused to hand over money to other developing nations for climate financing now? Rather, it prefers its own arrangements, its own rules. Now, emissions have gone up slightly in China this year, but with the scale of its renewables installation, they could actually peak well before 2030, which is the current target. That does push the needle, and it pushes others to be more ambitious, and it's momentum that I think is hard to stop. So a big watch for me over the next year. Okay, before we get to the quiz, Liling, you want to give us a bit of a final end of the year weather report? I want to know what to expect here in Bangkok and which holiday destinations others might want to consider for our long-awaited break.
I thought you'd never ask. If you're listening in from the Northern Hemisphere and looking for a warm and balmy winter escape, look no further than Southeast Asia, where you're bound to be heat-smacked by the scorching sun and pummeled by the crushing weight of the kind of humidity you can only find in the more southern parts of this exquisite holiday destination. Too hot to handle? No worries. December is usually the coolest time of the year, so you can expect brief breaks of thundery showers to cool you down within a day, where temperature and precipitation can swing back and forth so erratically that you get to experience an entire year's worth of seasons all in a day. It's bang for your buck. Fancy a city tour? How about a cold Long Island tea in hand while basking in the warm embrace of the urban island heat effect? And for the more adventurous, there's always extreme weather to be had as we head into the monsoon season, where you might get to experience firsthand heavy downpours and flooding, just like in the movies. Don't forget to pack your goggles and sunscreen.
Okay, that made no sense to me. I've got no idea what weather we're expecting.
It's just wet, erratic. Yeah, hot and wet.
Okay, quiz time. To repeat the question, which of these records was not broken in 2024? A, the amount of deforestation occurring around the world. B, the amount of production of oil globally. C, the hottest daily global average temperature. Or D, the levels of methane recorded in the atmosphere. And we've given some of these away already.
Yes, so we've talked about the production of oil globally hitting new highs. We've talked about record high temperatures as well this year. You talked about methane. The only thing I think that hasn't really hit new record highs this year is deforestation. So I'm going to go with A.
You are correct.
Woohoo!
2016 was the peak of deforestation. I should note that deforestation has continued. It is still happening. It's not going down at the rates that would match the targets that many countries have set, but it's not the worst we've ever done. Yeah. Take that silver lining. Okay, that's it for this episode of Climate Conversations. Thanks as always for joining us. We've had a great year bringing different stories and issues to you. Great to chat every week with you as well, Liling. And we'll be back right here early in the new year.
And do catch up with some of our favorite episodes from throughout the year, dropping over the holiday period. And see you all next year. Until then, I'm Liling Tan saying bye-bye.
And I'm Jack Board. Thank you to the team that helps put together this podcast. Saye Win, Tiffany Ang, Janani Jahari, and Crispina Robert.
Happy holidays!